This video has been brought to you by Squarespace. More on that later. I have covered some truly awful Lord of the Rings documentaries in the past, but this one is somehow the worst. A fact made all the more impressive considering that this one was made by the actual History Channel. And you might say that I shouldn't expect more from the History Channel. They are, after all, the people that brought us this.
Some ancient mythologies speak of the fact that some of these stones were put into place with sound.
But the History Channel has something that all of the other documentaries that I've watched did not. A budget. And the legal right to make the thing, but that's besides the point. They clearly had the money to do a good job with this thing. They hired actual experts like Corey Olsen, and yet somehow, by some supernatural feat, they have managed to create a 45-minute documentary that says next to nothing helpful. Now, I really struggled to make this video. This is my fourth try at it, but I realized that that's because of this thing's main problem. The information is so random, so poorly organized, that it makes no logical sense. Forming an argument against this documentary's thesis or disproving its points would require the documentary to have a thesis and make points, but alas, it does not. So instead, I'm going to walk you through this documentary step by step, disproving, debunking, and complaining wherever necessary. So without any further ado, from the studio that brought you Chasin' Mummies, Big Shrimpin', and Pawn Stars, I present the 2009 documentary, Tolkien's Fantasy World of Monsters and Myth. This documentary sets out with very lofty aspirations.
Now, discover the facts behind the fiction. This is the real story of the Lord of the Rings.
I kind of hate the phrase, the real story, because even if I have used it in a video thumbnail before, it really is just clickbait. What is a real story? Is the fact that Tolkien based The Lord of the Rings off of a mythological precedent more of a real story than the actual narrative? It's basically a nonsense phrase, and the fact that they used it as the thesis of their documentary is not a particularly good omen. We jump right into Frodo at Green Screen Mount Doom. And we are getting some grade A, classic History Channel editing here.
The long, arduous journey of Frodo Baggins has come to an end.
You get the heartbeat sound effect, the musical stings, the dramatic zoom-ins. It's quality stuff. Thank you so much, History Channel. As I mentioned before, this documentary does feature Corey Olsen as a speaker, which is honestly a great choice. Olsen is all around pretty well respected, especially in the world of online Tolkien scholarship. Honestly, he and the other folks that they brought in really aren't the problem. They make some pretty good points. The editing just managed to chop up what they were saying so much that it's like they didn't say anything at all. It's a neat trick. It is kind of funny though that in this Corey Olsen still has a full head of hair. I wonder if watching the final edit of this is what finally did his scalp in. After establishing that The Lord of the Rings is based on myth, they begin just rattling off mythic comparisons. They tell us that the name of Middle-earth is based off of Midgard from Norse legends. They tell us that there was a disappearing ring in the tales of King Arthur. They tell us that the Norse Volsunga saga had an evil ring in it. Then they make a quick pit stop off to describe Gollum's fall from grace due to the influence of the ring, including this truly inspired take on his character design.
After possessing the ring for nearly 500 years, Gollum loses it.
Truly, he looks like a slee stack. It's inspiring. There's nothing factually inaccurate about this rapid-fire myth referencing. What I struggle with is the fact that there's no synthesis of this information. There's no deeper look at why Tolkien was drawn in to use these myths or tropes, why it matters that Middle-earth is Midgard. It's interesting information, but the writing of this piece doesn't take you any further than just mentioning a fun factoid. From here, we start talking about hobbits with a brief description of their race, a mention that the word hobbit sounds like habit, and a note that the Shire is pretty peaceful. They make a connection between the pastoral bliss of the hobbits and Tolkien's own countryside upbringing, and at this point, we get to see their actor for Tolkien. He is, curiously, quite mustachioed. This is a bold move, considering that a large mustache isn't exactly part of Tolkien's iconic image. I think there is one photograph that exists of him stashed up, but throughout his middle-aged life, when he was, writing The Lord of the Rings, he was quite clean-shaven. And I hate to nitpick, but again, this is the History Channel. If you're going to pick an actor to play someone who we have quite a few pictures of, why would you not, I don't know, pick someone who looks like Tolkien? At least a little bit? Was there not one singular, blue-eyed, clean-shaven man in your entire casting call? Or you could have just used a picture of Tolkien here instead of the same video clip over and over again of generic British man in the shadows trying to seduce you. After giving us the Hobbit rundown, they say,
A hobbit is the last creature one might expect to save the world from evil, but Frodo Baggins is different.
And is he really? He's probably more educated than most hobbits, and he has a hint of Tookish blood in him, but isn't the whole point of the story kind of that he is just like every other hobbit? They say,
and he cares about the outside world enough to sacrifice everything he actually loves.
And again, sort of. But Frodo also states that the reason he is willing to leave the Shire and go out and try to save the world is not because of some lofty aspirations of becoming a hero for all of the species of Middle-earth, but because he wants to keep his home safe. I should like to save the Shire if I could, though there have been times when I thought the inhabitants too stupid and dull for words. I feel that as long as the Shire lies behind, safe and comfortable, I shall find wandering more bearable. I shall know that somewhere there is a firm foothold, even if my feet cannot stand there again. If you need a special sort of hobbit to save the day, I think you're kind of missing the point that hobbits are special because they are hobbits. Still, the documentary is right when it says,
if you go back to these original myths, you're looking at the heroes themselves, the warriors, if you will. Tolkien then takes this story and he tells it from the point of view of a not likely hero, the reluctant warrior. And that, I think, is rather unique.
And that's true. That's a neat point. I just think that it needs a little bit more elaboration. Because the whole angle of this documentary thus far has been Tolkien ripped XYZ thing out of myth. So it is unique and it is interesting when he takes a major traditional story beat and turns it on its head. It's saying something. It's saying that I appreciate what these old myths did, but in this new story that I'm writing, in this new mythology for England, there is something that means that hobbits, that everyday men, should be the heroes. And they are so close to making an actual point about the way that Tolkien utilized old myths and his new perceptions of the world to create stories for the modern age that still draw from their mythic origins, and nope, we're gonna move on. They talk about how Frodo was tempted by evil and how the fixation on the ring sort of acts as an addiction, and then immediately change the subject.
More than 20 years after The Lord of the Rings was first published, its forgotten blueprint emerged, revealing for the first time how the most ambitious myth of the modern era really begins.
This is just such a weird structural choice. You could have taken the route of following Tolkien's publishing, beginning with The Hobbit, then the emergence of The Lord of the Rings, and then how he was working on the Silmarillion until its posthumous publication. Or you could have followed in-universe chronology, beginning with the creation of the world, following all the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and ending in the destruction of the ring. You could have even followed Tolkien's own life story, starting with his younger childhood, his teenage years, and then going into him formulating the myths of the Silmarillion, writing The Hobbit, and publishing The Lord of the Rings. Instead, they decided, let's talk about Frodo on Mount Doom, the ring, Smeagol, the Shire, Frodo on Mount Doom again, and then go back to the Silmarillion without ever having even mentioned The Hobbit, the first published book in the series. It makes no sense. Either way, they make a brief stop to talk about Tolkien's world building, including this.
A whole mythic place that was a whole world, very populated, with a whole geography and a whole ability to map it. If you wanted an example in the modern period, you would look at the world created with Star Wars, for example.
Now, I am going to try and be delicate here, because I know that a lot of my audience, especially considering my audience demographic, are probably Star Wars fans, and I don't hate Star Wars, but trying to say that the world building of Star Wars is comparable to that of The Lord of the Rings? No. I think that by now, a lot of it has been fleshed out by other authors, but for George Lucas, the intent seems to never have been creating a logically consistent, fully immersive world. It was making a sandbox to have fun in. Historical events clash, things have to be retconned, and it's just nowhere near the obsessive perfectionism that fueled Tolkien's meticulously built worlds. There's nothing wrong with that type of world building, but it's not really an apt comparison to make. Also, she says that Star Wars is an example from the modern period. When does she think that The Lord of the Rings was written? It's less than 100 years old. That is well within the modern period. Plus, if we want to get nitpicky, which I obviously do, the first Star Wars movie actually came out a couple of months before The Silmarillion, meaning that The Silmarillion and its associated myths are actually more contemporary than Star Wars. So not only is Star Wars a shoddy comparison to make to The Lord of the Rings when it comes to world building, it's also not necessary as a modern comparison because The Lord of the Rings is already modern. From there, we go on to talk about Tolkien's childhood again, especially his Catholic faith, and how that faith was fueled on by the death of his mother. They bring this up in order to make the point that the creation story of The Lord of the Rings is an intrinsically Christian tale.
In Tolkien's story, there is one supreme god called Ilúvatar. He creates angelic beings called the Ainur, who sing songs so beautiful that the world springs forth from them.
And I have two problems with this. First off, what is it that you just called those angelic beings?
Ainur. Ainur.
Are you sure you couldn't do a real quick Google search on the pronunciation of that word before you hit the recording booth? It's Ainur. Everybody pronounces it Ainur, as far as I'm aware. Except this documentary. My second problem is that they don't explore it any further than that. They move on. You brought up Tolkien's faith because it apparently deeply impacted this creation story, so explain to us how that is the case. Like, beyond there being one god and angelic beings, there is no inherent connection in what you just said there. And there are so many points you could make here, like how the Ainur only know little parts of Ilúvatar's mind, just in the way that angels aren't gifted with the full omniscience of God. You could even mention the creative spark of Middle-earth, which is called the Flame Imperishable, and closely resembles the Holy Spirit or the Breath of God. You could even go crazy and mention Morgoth's fall from grace, who, despite being gifted all of Ilúvatar's favor, still wanted more. A story that so closely resembles Satan's fall from heaven that it is practically a ripoff. Saying there is a connection and then listing vaguely related facts isn't a point at all. It's very barely even interesting. Make a point or don't say anything. From there, we evidently move on from the Silmarillion entirely, talking about Tolkien's invention of the word Hobbit.
The famous stories, he was grading exams, a student had left a page blank, and Tolkien wrote on it, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit."
Sure, that's fine, it's all technically factual, but since you seem to be avoiding the topic of The Hobbit as a book, it feels like a bit of a leap to go from the Song of the Ainur to the back of an exam booklet. They use this as a clumsy leaping off point to talk about languages, something I am astonished it has taken them 17 minutes to get to. Tolkien was, above all, a philologist, a linguist. Languages had fascinated him from a very early age, and he had been inventing and crafting languages long before he ever pursued it in an academic scene. Tolkien's languages are not, as this documentary seems to imply, an accessory for his world building and story crafting. They are the heart of it. He created the Silmarillion as a way to give structure, history, and culture to the languages that he was creating. So the fact that you managed to get through 17 minutes of a documentary titled Tolkien's Fantasy Worlds without ever mentioning languages, it boggles the mind. They don't even really make a good point with this, other than saying that Elvish is based on Finnish and dwarves had runes, which were historically there. There could have been an interesting point here about how he frames The Lord of the Rings as a lost historical text that he is reviving and translating for the modern age, like Beowulf or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and how this desire to imitate historical texts has impacted the story. But nope, that is a level of through line that we apparently cannot expect from the History Channel. They use the runes as an excuse to talk about dwarves, which they then bring around finally to the Hobbit, almost halfway through the documentary. And naturally, Smaug.
The magic writing on the map leads Bilbo to the lair of Smaug, the most dreaded dragon in Middle-earth. This is the monster who holds the treasure.
Couple of things to say here. First off, Smaug is the most dreaded dragon in Middle-earth by process of elimination, I guess, since he was the only dragon at this point living in Middle-earth. But if you did want to compare him to, you know, other dragons, he is far from the most dreadful. I think that title would have to go to Ancalagon the Black, who is, you know, called the greatest dragon to ever live, who is so large and powerful that he destroyed 3 whole mountains. I think he counts. This is so funny, because the narrator calls Smaug the most dreaded dragon to live in Middle-earth, and then a minute later, one of the interviewees points out that Smaug is the last dragon in Middle-earth.
Smaug is the last of the great golden dragons.
And kudos to him for pointing out that Smaug is the last dragon, but he also calls him a golden dragon? The term golden dragon isn't really used by Tolkien. As cool as the Dragonology books were, and they were really cool, Tolkien doesn't really categorize them by color in that way. He vaguely identifies some that crawl instead of fly, like Glaurung, and he talks about cold drakes, but there's no category of golden dragon. Smaug is also described in The Hobbit as a red golden dragon, which is not the same as a golden dragon. It's just a weird spot of misinformation. Their 3D model for Smaug, though, certainly lives up to that name, and he is built just so buff, and when he starts flying, boy howdy, does he look like a dog with wings. Now, technically speaking, they did get this right, because classically, dragons have 4 legs and a pair of wings, so that's 6 limbs in all, whereas wyverns have 2 legs and 2 wings, meaning they only have 4 sets of limbs. Smaug is a dragon, and in Tolkien's art, he does have 4 legs and 2 wings, but still, doesn't he just look a little bit silly? This is actually an issue that the crew of the Hobbit films ran into. Early drafts of Smaug had the traditional 4 legs, 2 wings design, to the point that the first film came out and the snippets of Smaug that we see are that traditional dragon design. However, when they were working on the second movie, they realized that the 4-leg dragon design was just a little bit too cutesy and looked way too heavy to be flying, and so they changed him to the wyvern layout. They later reanimated the scene from the first movie for later releases so that it would be the actual design of Smaug instead of the 4-legged version. And I think that the flying sequences in this documentary really exemplify why this was a good choice, because he looks like a pit bull with wings. We also get a stunning shot of Bilbo entering the dragon's lair, a Bilbo who is, well, he's looking a little long in the tooth. He's old. Bilbo in the books is meant to be 50, and I'm not great at assessing ages, but I think that even by human standards, which are different from Hobbit standards, this actor is a little over the hill. It's just a very odd choice, because I'm pretty certain that there is a reasonably sized pool of 45-year-old actors, and I feel like the History Channel had the budget to find one. They then explained that the whole myth behind Smaug is the Beowulf killing the dragon thing, which is fine, but could have been more interesting. It's a bit of a recurring theme with this one. From there, we take a hard left turn into the trauma that Tolkien experienced in the First World War, a situation that they describe as
a terrifying trauma laden with ghosts, blood, and death.
I'll be the first to admit, I wasn't around during World War I, and my only real education on the whole thing comes from a YA series that I read when I was 11, but I do not remember anyone telling me about these ghosts? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I am wondering why you chose to mention ghosts, blood, and death in that order, when I feel like the death and blood are probably more important than ghosts, unless there was a Return of the King Deus Ex Machina style ghost army that appeared in 1918 that they simply forgot to mention in textbooks. Honestly, this whole section is fine. It does an okay job of covering Tolkien's experiences in the war and the general societal context of what the war meant, other than the ghosts, but they are missing out on a lot of interesting stuff, like the fact that Tolkien began work on the legends that would become the Silmarillion while he was in the trenches, or the fact that Tolkien frequently denied allegorical connections between the Lord of the Rings and the real world, especially for those that tried to turn it into a one-to-one comparison to his experiences in the First World War. They wait until the very end of this section to even mention.
In France, he fought alongside 3 of his oldest and closest friends, but by November of 1916, 2 of them were dead.
If we had been following along the timeline of Tolkien's life, even somewhat chronologically, we would have heard about these friends before, and so the loss of them would have made much more impact. Learning about someone's existence in one sentence, and then their death in the next, is just lazy writing. If they had chosen some kind of narrative thread, a slightly more compelling way of piecing together these disparate facts, we would have something that was much more compelling and easy to follow. But no, instead they start walking us through Frodo's journey through the dead marshes, and they propose that a bog filled with dead bodies from a previous war might have been Tolkien's way of speaking out against the war machine. A truly daring take. They carry on to talk about Mordor and orcs, telling us that Mordor is a lot like hell and that orcs are evil.
Orcs are very horrible. They are bent, they are crooked, they are ugly. We are told that they are actually elves gone wrong.
There's no greater point about how the manipulation of elves into orcs leads into Tolkien's idea of how evil cannot create, only corrupt, an idea that you could note is very Christian in origin, but instead they just go on this tangent.
They are described as creatures fascinated with machines, fascinated with making clever things, fascinated with profit, who try to get other people to work for them. This has been read as sort of a thinly disguised capitalist, or capitalism, the orcs as capitalists.
I have a couple of problems with this observation. First off, you're just jumping to conclusions. Tolkien does imply that orcs are being paid for their work, but I don't think there's enough textual evidence to imply that they are so obsessed with profit that they can be called the models of capitalism. Also, I don't think Tolkien would have been trying to condemn capitalism like this. Although he never outright stated that he was a capitalist, Tolkien was very conservative, both politically and socially, and he did condemn socialism in writing in a couple of places. Taking into consideration Tolkien's political leanings, as well as the other things that he wrote, I think it would be much more fair to characterize orcs as the epitome of ruthless industrialization and progress without consideration for anything else. That does not equal capitalism. Of course, you can get things out of the text that Tolkien didn't mean to put in there, and the interviewee definitely could try and make this argument, but the documentary doesn't give him enough space to properly explore and contextualize this idea. The fact that it was sort of plopped in there without any further explanation is bizarre. From there, they make the obligatory, vague connection to myth.
In line 512 of Beowulf, there's a description of all the evil creatures that have been descended from Cain after Cain killed his brother Abel. And those are Eotonas and Ylfa and Orkneas, and that is Ettins and elves and Orkneas.
The Orkneys are demon-like beings in Beowulf. They have a spirit-like quality, but they're considered like an evil spirit being.
And sure, that's the origin of the name, but what about the fact that Beowulf's Orkneas are spirits, whereas Tolkien's orcs are definitely not the ghosts we found in World War I? Why would Tolkien take that name but then change their nature? What was he trying to say by doing that? We could dive into this point, but no, we are moving on without any further explanation.
Historical sources inspired not only Middle-earth's most despised fiends, but also one of its principal heroes, the wizard Gandalf.
They mention that Gandalf is very similar to Odin the Wanderer and also Jesus Christ, considering that he died and was resurrected.
This is what is so unique about Tolkien. He is very good at bringing together Christian and pagan motif.
That's great. It is a cool point, but why does it matter? Is Tolkien making a statement about British culture, how the society that he was writing this new myth for is a blending of paganism and Christianity, finding the balance between old and new, creating a new model of hero for the post-war era? Was he rewriting these figures of the old world into his new mythos that would meld better with his Christian ideals? These ideas are not incidental. Yes, Tolkien was a master of blending paganism and Christianity, but why did he do it? What does that tell us about what he wrote other than the fact that he wrote it?
The religious influences behind The Lord of the Rings are fully revealed in the climax of the epic.
Now this is generally an idea I can get on board with. Let's see how they butcher it. We come back to where it all began, green screen Mount Doom, to talk a little bit about Frodo's choice at the end of the story, whether or not to get rid of the ring. They claim that Frodo's position, standing on the edge of Mount Doom considering this, illustrates 2 lines from the Christian Lord's Prayer: "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." They do not, however, explain that point any further, and it's a point that deserves explanation. Tom Shippey explains this idea of evil as having 2 opposing elements. There is an internal kind of evil, something that exists as a possibility, a temptation inside of everyone. It's this idea of evil being the shadow to good, as evil being the absence of good, a constantly creeping temptation from the inside out to do bad things. Then there's also the external view of evil as a force pushing on you, a dark lord tempting you towards evil. Thus, the Lord's Prayer, with its dual pleas to lead us not into temptation, the internal draw towards evil, and deliver us from evil, rebuking the external forces of evil, encompasses these 2 opposing views of evil, weaving them together to perfectly describe Frodo's struggle on the crack of doom, buffeted between internal temptation and external pressure, helpless except for divine intervention. If you just drop that line in there like the documentary did, just saying that this moment is illustrated by this line in this prayer, you don't say anything. That's like me saying that the barrel scene in The Hobbit really illustrates the experience of my early 20s. It allows you to infer how I felt about that experience, but if you're hearing this in an educational documentary, you're probably gonna want a little bit further clarification. Is it just the whole scene that I like it, that it's a vibe, or is it that very particular moment where Bombur bursts out of the water, lands on the shore in a barrel, and starts axe murdering people feels a lot like the way it felt to get this channel up and running? You can't just drop a hot take in randomly if you want to make an educational documentary. You have to be ready and prepared to explain this point. After building up this moment of Frodo on the crack of doom as the manifestation of the Christian message Tolkien was trying to tell, after comparing Frodo's testing here to the testing of Jesus by Satan in the desert, they then tell us that Frodo fails. But Frodo's failure here is one of the most exciting things about The Lord of the Rings, because they do set this up to be his final test, his final proof of his heroism, and it really looks like he fails. But what this documentary doesn't even try to touch on is the fact that this is not a failure. He takes the ring as his own, yes, but that doesn't constitute a failure. Tolkien was so certain of this point that he wrote a letter to discuss it. Frodo indeed failed as a hero, as conceived by simple minds. He did not endure to the end. He gave in, ratted. I do not think that Frodo's was a moral failure. At the last moment, the pressure of the ring would reach its maximum. Impossible, I should have said, for anyone to resist. Frodo had done what he could, and spent himself completely as an instrument of providence, and had produced a situation in which the object of his quest could be achieved. His humility, with which he began, and his sufferings, were justly rewarded by the highest honor, and his exercise of patience and mercy towards Gollum gained him mercy. His failure was redressed. His real contract was only to do what he could, to try to find a way, and to go as far on the road as his strength of mind and body allowed. He did that. Although Frodo, in the most surface-level way, did fail his quest, in a much more important and deep way, he did not. It was Frodo's earlier goodness, his righteousness through the entire story, that spared Gollum, that created the circumstances in which the ring was able to fall. Everyone would have failed in this moment. The temptation of the ring was simply far too great, but Frodo, by being good, by being true to himself, every single second leading up to this crucial moment, succeeds anyway. This is probably a great time to mention that Sam is not brought up a singular time in this whole 45-minute heap of garbage. And I'm sorry, I do understand trimming for conciseness, but Sam is the one who got Frodo up that mountain. Because it was also Frodo's friendship with Sam that kept this from being a true failure. Frodo's friendship with Sam is one of the things that makes him such a hero, one of the hobbity things that keeps him true even when all else fails. All of this nuance, however, is lost, and the documentary truly shoots itself in the foot. This whole scene, and all of its moral complexity, is summed up like this.
A flawed hero who doesn't save the day. It's an ending that strays from Tolkien's Christian roots and mythological tradition.
Usually a tragic hero, no matter what happens to him, at least he can feel good because he's done the right thing. Frodo could not.
Despite Frodo's failure, the final outcome echoes the Christian belief that good will triumph over evil.
The documentary is basically claiming that, yes, Tolkien set this scene up to be the climax of the good versus evil arc that has weaved its way through the whole story, carefully taking in Christian and mythic and pagan traditions, but in the end, Frodo just messes it up, so he makes it a happy ending anyway. This is honestly just so frustrating. It demonstrates such a surface-level comprehension of the text, or honestly a misunderstanding, because anyone who cares about this story, I seriously doubt thinks that Tolkien could write something as stupid as that. This moment at the crack of doom is the climax of the story, the fulfillment of pages and pages of philosophical, moral, and thematic buildup, and this documentary swings and misses this scene by a mile. From here, we get a half-hearted mention of the scouring of the Shire, and how it embodies Tolkien's fear of industrialization.
Tolkien was deeply concerned from his early childhood about the process of industrialization, in large part because he saw it as a reflection of human corruption.
Great! Could we make an observation about how Sauron, as the one who brought this evil into the Shire, his particular proclivity towards evil and his philosophy, and how that is the perfect representation of Tolkien's fear of hasty industrialization, or how the Hobbit's defeat of Saruman and the changes that occur in the Shire show us that there is a way to technologically advance as long as we do it mindfully? No? We're gonna move on without even mentioning how the scouring of the Shire was resolved? At all? Okay. We get a really quick overview on how Frodo is too injured to stay in Middle-earth and has to leave, which they compare to Tolkien and other soldiers' PTSD from the war, which is, again, a very original observation.
At the end of The Lord of the Rings, Frodo remains deeply wounded by his battle with evil. He leaves the Shire once and for all to seek a new beginning in Middle-earth's holy lands.
The reenactment of this scene, which just has Frodo wandering off into the snowy woods, it really kills me. Without having like the ships of Valinor ready to bear him off to eternal life and, carefully carried and accompanied by his closest friends, it implies more so that they just sent Frodo out to pasture to die, which, believe it or not, was not Tolkien's original intent. From here, they wrap things up really quickly. There's the obligatory mention of how ambitious The Lord of the Rings was, that it kickstarted the modern fantasy genre, that it's so interesting that it got such readership with just common readers, which would have been a really interesting idea to explore, but no! We can't because we're done. That's the end. There's one word that pops up 4 separate times in this documentary, and that is the word intriguing. They talk about the intriguing ties between Middle-earth and the Bible, the intriguing connections between Tolkien's life and the book. They use the phrase intriguing parallels twice in less than 3 minutes. And the word intriguing is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Because in this context, what does it mean? They're just pointing out something, a mythological connection, a connection to Tolkien's life, and going, intriguing. No. It works for ancient aliens when you're saying, isn't it intriguing that modern crop circles and ancient Mayan architecture both use shapes? but that's because they're making things up. But in almost every case here, they are not making something up. They're mentioning a well-researched, well-documented observation about an author and their source materials. This documentary acts like The Lord of the Rings is a relic, like Beowulf or Gilgamesh, and so it's so intriguing when this ancient text has real-world applicability. This was a book written by a man less than 100 years ago. These parallels are not just intriguing, they were carefully crafted by an author who knew exactly what he was doing with them. It was not created by chance, and by dismissing these ideas as incidental or intriguing, rather than investigating the how and why the author used these ideas to create a story, we do a huge disservice to the writer that crafted these worlds. This gets to the heart of an issue that I find in a lot of, especially modern Tolkien scholarship. He created such a dense and beautiful mythos that it is really easy to lose the idea that this was a fictional world created to tell a fictional story. If you're just looking at the facts, the dates of fictional wars, the names of made-up characters, the shape of illustrated maps, without investigating why Tolkien chose to make them that way, I think you're missing out on a lot of what made The Lord of the Rings so special. Back in high school, I had an English teacher who was giving us a lesson on how to write our big end-of-the-year research essays about an author or a story. She told us that it wasn't enough to just put research and facts and quotes into Times New Roman 12-point font, double-spaced. We had to look at this information, analyze it, and synthesize it. We had to look past the raw facts to see what they mean. This is something that I took with me, and it's something that I try to do on this channel as much as possible. If you want just straight up listed facts about Middle-earth, there are plenty of wikis you can check out. What an essay about Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, or a high-budget History Channel documentary, has the chance to do is to take that information and say, what was Tolkien doing? And wasting that opportunity on a 45-minute flashy cash grab, it seems like a pretty big waste to me. But you know what isn't a waste? The opportunity to make yourself a great website using this video sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that allows you to stand out and succeed online. Squarespace makes it so easy to build yourself a beautiful website where you can connect with your audience, sell products, and make content all on your own terms. They've made the website building process so seamless, especially with their professional website templates. They have so many options to choose from, and they make it really convenient to customize these templates to your aesthetic and your look and your unique needs. If you want to be able to connect with your audience, you can use their blogging feature to share pictures, videos, and updates. And if you'd like a more personal approach, you can even run an email campaign straight from their website. Squarespace will collect email addresses for you, and this makes it incredibly convenient to send updates and announcements and keep your audience in the loop. And you can track the impact of your email campaign with their built-in analytics. Whether you're just starting out or you're ready to take your brand to the next level, you can go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessOfTheShire for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and to you guys for checking out my sponsors when I have them. This documentary was one of the things that made me make this channel. I started watching it and I was so baffled by it, so irritated by it, even when, to be honest, I didn't know that much about Tolkien at all. I knew something about this documentary just wasn't right, and to be honest, it feels pretty good to be getting this off my chest. I would love to hear what you guys thought of this in the comments below, whether or not you thought I was being too harsh, or maybe not harsh enough. I will admit that any documentary that gets people talking about The Lord of the Rings is a good thing. I just wish that people would be a little bit more mindful with the media they create. If you enjoyed this video or you learned something new, consider giving it a like, and if you want to stick around on this channel where I talk about The Lord of the Rings and fantasy and all things storytelling, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Videos like this are made possible due to the very generous support of my patrons, so a huge thank you to all of those who support me on Patreon. Thank you all so much for watching this week, and I hope that you have a very happy Hobbity day.